was Andrew Carnegie? Well, in order to learn who he was, we have to go back in time into the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age was a time of post-Civil War, so it's going to be at the very end of the 1800s, started about the mid-1800s actually. And it was an era of economic growth, industrialization, new technology, and a lot of people were switching from farms into cities in order to get factory jobs. The market was changing, the job market was changing. And not only that, before the Gilded Age of America, a lot of people were either really poor or really rich. This was the start of the middle class in America, like how we have a middle class today. People were able to afford things. They weren't really poor, but they weren't really rich. They were affording life. During this era, because of the industrialization and new technologies like the phone, the telegraph, railroads, which is very important during this time, there was a need for markets and big business. America was starting to be the number one spot for cotton, steel, oil, and wheat. And because there's big business, there's money to be made. And that's when Carnegie comes into play. Now, Andrew Carnegie during this time was a baron. Now, what is a baron? Well, you can think about nowadays Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates. It is a rich, influential individual who had a lot of power in business. These were your very first billionaires in America. They were the big boss men of it all. They held power in oil, steel, railroads, all of these big businesses and markets they held power over. Now, some examples of these people during this era was, of course, Andrew Carnegie, but also J.G. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. He stands out between these two because of his early life during this time. He was not born an American citizen, nor was he born into any type of money. He was dirt poor and born in Scotland in 1835. Now, his parents were weavers, which they would weave wheat or whatever, but because of how poor he was, he had no education. Though his parents did believe how important it was to have an education, therefore he was self-taught on a lot of things and read a lot of books. But this idea of how important education has definitely influenced his life going further, and we'll talk about that more later on. Now, he moved to America in 1848 at the age of 13 and got his first job in a factory and made a little over $1 a week, which, think about it now, we make $9, $14 an hour, which is insane how little money people made back in the day. Now, he then also got a job as a telegraph manager, but his most important job that really started his career was his job at the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. At this company, he worked his way up and actually was kind of shadowing one of the directors there named Thomas Scott. Thomas Scott, even though again he had no education, Thomas Scott taught him a lot about businesses and a lot about railroads, in which how he then started to work his way up and get to his idea of business at the very end. Now, his idea of business did come from his experience with the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, but he then eventually left the Pennsylvania Railroad Company in 1865 and started his own business called the Carnegie Steel Company. Before he created his own business and before he left, he did make minor investments in other businesses while he worked. One of them was the oil market at this time, as he saw more of a payoff investing in oil than anything, which is kind of funny because then he made a steel business and not an oil business. But the reason why his business was so successful, as it was the number one steel business in the entire world actually during this time, was because of the vertical method that he made up. Again, he had no education. He only shadowed Thomas Scott while he was working with the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. So a lot of this was made up in his mind, and he was very, very intelligent. He found out that owning each method of production made product cheaper. It made it more profitable. So not only did he own the steel factory, he also owned the way to ship the steel. He owned the way to mine the steel. He owned every way, so then he controls the market a little bit more, but also produces it and is able to make it at the cheapest price. So people go towards him and not other people. And this method still works today. If you look at Little Caesars uses the exact same method to have the cheapest pizza on the market. Amazon uses it today as they started their own little, you can get pencils, Amazon Basics, like school supplies. They created these little mini companies within their company in order to have more control over the market. Now, do not confuse the vertical method with the horizontal method. The horizontal method was through J.D. Rockefeller, and that's when he bought out his small businesses around him, his competition, in order to basically create a monopoly and own the market. But don't confuse that. So, Andrew Carnegie, because of steel. Steel is in everything. This has steel in it. The table that I'm sitting at has steel. During this time, railroads were being created. They needed steel in order to have that or to maintain production. They had trains, the new advancements in technology and businesses and factories. Steel was so important at this time. So without Andrew Carnegie, America would not be what it is today. Now, let's talk about his morals. Not only did him being an immigrant and, being born poor and making himself rich, make him really stand out in the other barons, but one thought process that he had was philanthropy, which really made him stand out from the others. He also helped influence the others to do the same. Basically, philanthropy is charity, specifically for richer people to do charity. He believed the rich is obligated to help the poor, and he believed that dying rich was a sin. And this is shown in a book that he wrote further along the way after he actually sold his business. We'll get into that in a second. Called The Gospel of Wealth, where he talked about these thought processes and how, again, the rich needs to give to the poor. He funded many organizations such as hospitals, soup kitchens, especially a lot of libraries and a lot of educational stuff, which again, he was raised that education was important and he didn't have a lot of education growing up. So he started to influence that setting in America. Now, his belief on philanthropy actually influenced the end of his life majorly. He sold his business to J.P. Morgan for $200 million. Now think about it. He was making, as a factory worker, a little bit over $1 a week. So that's 200 million work weeks during this time. That's a lot of money. He sold it and started to live his life of charity. He donated 5 million, get it? 5 million work weeks. $5 million to the New York Library. And that way they created more branches and put more libraries around New York City. He also created the Carnegie Mellon University, which I think they renamed, but it was located in Pittsburgh. And he then also not only donated money to that university, he also donated to other universities, but also created a foundation for education, because he believed how strong education, how important it was during this time. He had other foundations called the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement in Technology. Again, technology was growing at this time. Businesses were sprawling out. So he invested this money in order to grow it. Grow America a little bit more, I guess. And he also believed he was, you could say, a little bit more progressive during this time. Now, progressivism is a little different than it is nowadays, but he was friends with people like Teddy Roosevelt, which, look at his policies, he was a little bit progressive. Not considered progressive for today's time because he was a little bit racist, but Teddy Roosevelt was progressive in some of his policies, and he was friends with Carnegie. And you can see how that makes sense, because Carnegie created the Endowment for International Peace. He wanted to work on making work environments better, rights for everyone, for all, and things like that. Now, he also donated to not only the New York State Library, he also donated to 3,000 other libraries around around America. And during his business endeavors, when he owned his business, employed 20,000 U.S. workers. So he had a lot of impact on America in positive ways. But there was one conflict we're about to get into. Despite all his positive endeavors, his positive mindset, and how much he benefited America, there was one conflict that technically wasn't his fault, but he got blamed for it because it was under his company. This conflict was called the Homestead Steel Strike, and this happened at the Carnegie Steel Plant. The manager, Henry Clayfrick, You could say he was a prick. He cut wages of workers and also replaced a lot of workers with machinery, which of course during this time, the factory jobs were their livelihood. If they didn't have that job, they didn't have money. They could not live. Again, people were switching from living on their own farms to relying on big businesses to fund them. Therefore, people were angry, people were mad, and they decided to strike. They would sit outside of the factory and not go to work, and they would protest. Well, of course, Henry, he didn't really like this a lot. Now, the union leader did try to negotiate something with Henry, and he was not budging. He was not having it. So, during these strikes, Henry put out people called Pinkertons. Pinkertons were like secret undercover agents trying to stop the union workers, but also trying to see what workers were, striking and get more information. Of course, this led to violence and violent acts to the point where the government sent 18,000 troops to try to break up the strike. Even then, even though the strike had troops to break it up, it did last months after this. But because of the violence and everything like that, 11 people died, which is very tragic. Carnegie during this time, though, what was he doing? Well, he was on vacation. He had no idea about this strike until he got back home, and he regretted being away. He wished he was there because he didn't stand for any of this. He didn't like the idea of what Henry Clay Frick did, but of course, he got blamed for it. Again, this isn't the time where you can send a text like, hey buddy, they're striking. No, that wasn't the time for that type of communication. So again, he didn't find out until he got home. But besides this one tragic event and probably other work environments not being the safest, Andrew Carnegie still had a huge impact on America. Again, if we want to do a recap, he created the vertical method that is still used today to grow businesses and make cheaper product. He also funded a lot of organizations to help build America and believed in charity. People like Mr. Beast are heavily influenced by his ideas. As Mr. Beast, the reason he got popular is he was putting so much money into these organizations and making videos on it, and then taking that money and putting it into more organizations, and it just became like a flow of profiting off of philanthropy, which still it has a benefit to it. Not only that, steel is super important in America. Everything we have, our phones, again, this whiteboard, this table has steel in it. And a lot of our big factory machines are made with steel. So if you really think about next time you go out somewhere, think about, Andrew Carnegie really helped benefited that. I hope you have a great day and see you later.